June 6, 1944, 12:16 a.m., 5,000 feet above Normandy. Major John Howard sat in the lead horse glider, watching the French coast materialize through darkness below. Behind him sat 28 men from D Company, 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, silent and focused as the glider descended toward their objective. In 2 other gliders following close behind, 58 more men prepared for landing. Their mission was to capture 2 bridges crossing the Caen Canal and Orne River before German defenders could destroy them, securing a critical route for British forces landing at Sword Beach 6 miles away. The plan was precise, rehearsed for months, and seemingly impossible. The gliders would land within yards of the bridges in darkness, allowing no time for defenders to react. Howard's men would storm both bridges simultaneously, overwhelm German guards before demolition charges could be triggered, and hold against counterattacks until relieved by Allied forces advancing from the beaches. Any deviation from the plan meant failure. If the bridges were destroyed, British armor couldn't advance inland, leaving invasion forces trapped on beaches where German reinforcements would destroy them. Everything depended on surprise, speed, and Howard's ability to execute orders perfectly. But Howard had already decided that if the situation demanded it, he would disobey his orders. The plan assumed both bridges would be lightly defended and could be taken quickly. Howard's training and instincts told him that combat rarely went according to plan, that assumptions about enemy strength were often wrong, and that rigid adherence to orders could be suicidal when reality didn't match planning assumptions. He told his platoon commanders privately that if circumstances required deviating from orders to accomplish the mission, they should use their judgment and accept responsibility later. This attitude contradicted military doctrine emphasizing obedience to orders, but Howard believed that commanders in combat had to think independently when plans broke down. The story of Pegasus Bridge begins not with the assault itself, but with the recognition by Allied planners that D-Day's success depended on securing dozens of specific objectives beyond the landing beaches. Bridges, crossroads, coastal batteries, and communication centers all had to be captured or destroyed at precise times to prevent German forces from concentrating against the invasion. The 2 bridges near Bénouville, spanning the Caen Canal and Orne River, were particularly critical. They provided the only route for British armor to advance east of the Orne, protecting the invasion's eastern flank from German counterattack. Intelligence photographs showed both bridges were defended by small German garrisons and had been prepared for demolition. Explosives were positioned to destroy the structures if invasion seemed imminent. Standard doctrine would suggest bombing the bridges or having paratroopers secure them after landing nearby. But bombing risked destroying the bridges themselves, and paratroopers scattered across the drop zone would take hours to assemble and attack. By then, German defenders would have destroyed the bridges or reinforced them beyond what lightly armed airborne troops could overcome. The solution was a coup de main operation, landing glider-borne infantry directly beside the bridges with no warning, overwhelming defenders before they could react. This was extraordinarily risky. Gliders landing at night had minimal control, might crash, and would certainly scatter men across the landing zone. Any delay in assembly would give defenders time to destroy bridges. German units in the area, including the 21st Panzer Division, could counterattack within hours. The assault force would be isolated 6 miles from the nearest Allied forces and surrounded by Germans. Success required perfect execution and extraordinary courage from men who would be among the first Allied soldiers fighting in occupied France. Major John Howard, selected to command the operation, was 31 years old and had risen through the ranks from private to officer through competence and determination. He wasn't from the social class that typically provided British officers, but had proven himself through performance. His men, volunteers from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, were selected for physical fitness, initiative, and aggression. They trained for 6 months specifically for this mission, rehearsing bridge assaults until every man knew his role perfectly. Mock-ups of the bridges were constructed in southern England, and the company practiced night assaults until they could capture objectives in darkness as efficiently as in daylight. The training emphasized speed and violence. Doctrine called for deliberate attacks with fire support and careful coordination. Howard taught his men to move fast, shoot first, and overwhelm defenders through shock and aggression. This contradicted conventional tactics that minimized casualties through careful preparation, but Howard believed surprise and speed were better protection than caution. The first seconds of combat would determine success. Hesitation would give defenders time to destroy bridges or organize resistance. Howard drilled his men to act instantly, trusting that aggression would paralyze defenders long enough for the assault to succeed. The glider pilots, drawn from the Glider Pilot Regiment, were among the most skilled in the British military. They had trained for precision night landings and understood that landing within yards of the target was essential. Standard glider operations allowed landing zones hundreds of yards from objectives, acceptable for delivering troops who would then walk to targets. This mission required landing so close that troops could sprint to objectives before defenders realized attackers had arrived. The pilots would have one approach: no power to correct mistakes, and landing zones bordered by ditches, trees, and obstacles that could destroy gliders on impact. The mission plan assigned 3 gliders to each bridge. The first glider would land as close as possible, with troops rushing the bridge immediately. The second would land nearby, troops securing the far bank and preventing demolition. The third would provide reserve and support. Timing was critical. All 6 gliders had to land within minutes of each other so that both bridges were attacked simultaneously, preventing defenders at one bridge from reinforcing the other. The coordination required was extraordinary and depended on pilots navigating to separate landing zones at night, releasing from tow aircraft at precise positions, and landing within seconds of each other. At 11:00 p.m. on June 5th, the 6 gliders lifted off from England towed by Halifax bombers. The crossing took approximately 1 hour, with gliders released from tow at 5,000 feet. The pilots descended through darkness, navigating by landmarks barely visible in moonlight, searching for the bridges they'd studied in photographs and models. There was no radio communication between gliders, no way to coordinate landings except through prior planning and pilot skill. Each glider operated independently once released from tow, depending on the pilot's judgment and experience. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork piloted the lead glider carrying Howard and the assault group for the canal bridge. He descended in a steep dive to maximize speed and minimize time exposed to potential ground fire, leveling off just feet above ground for the final approach. The landing was violent, with the glider striking ground, bouncing, breaking through fences, and sliding to a stop with the nose just yards from the canal bridge. The crash impact knocked some men unconscious and injured others, but the location was perfect. They were close enough to touch the bridge, exactly where they needed to be. Howard was first out, shaking off the impact, shouting for his men to follow. 28 men poured from the glider, some stunned, all carrying weapons and explosives. The German guard post on the bridge was 50 yards away. Howard and Lieutenant Den Brotheridge led the first platoon in a full sprint toward the bridge, firing as they ran. German sentries, shocked by sudden attack, had seconds to respond. One sentry ran toward the machine gun position. Another ran toward the detonator for demolition charges. Brotheridge shot the first sentry and threw grenades into the gun position before the Germans could return effective fire. The second and third gliders landed seconds behind the first, troops deploying and joining the assault. Within 90 seconds of landing, British troops controlled the canal bridge and had cut wires leading to demolition charges, preventing destruction. German defenders, approximately 50 men from a Wehrmacht construction unit, were overwhelmed by the sudden attack. Some surrendered, others fled, and a few fought back but were quickly suppressed. The Canal Bridge, the primary objective, was captured within 3 minutes of landing with no damage to the structure. But Lieutenant Brotheridge, leading the assault, was shot by a German sentry firing blind into the darkness. He died minutes later, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy action on D-Day. The loss was personally devastating to Howard, who had trained and led these men for months and felt responsible for every casualty. But there was no time for grief. The second bridge, across the Orne River 500 yards away, had to be secured before German defenders destroyed it. The 3 gliders assigned to the Orne Bridge had landed less precisely. One landed over a quarter-mile from the target. Another crashed into a pond, submerging and trapping men inside until they could break free. The third landed closer but still required troops to sprint hundreds of yards under fire. Yet somehow, through training and determination, the scattered troops assembled and attacked the second bridge, capturing it within 10 minutes. The defenders, alerted by gunfire from the Canal Bridge, had time to prepare but not enough to organize effective resistance or destroy the bridge. By 12:26 a.m., 10 minutes after the first glider landed, both bridges were captured intact. Howard's force controlled both structures and had established defensive positions expecting German counterattack. The mission's first phase succeeded beyond optimistic expectations. Perfect glider placement, aggressive assault, and German defender incompetence combined to achieve objectives with minimal casualties. But holding the bridges until relieved was another matter entirely. Howard's orders specified that relief would come from paratroopers dropping nearby and then from infantry advancing from Sword Beach. The paratroopers were expected within 30 minutes. Beach forces were expected by 1:00 p.m., 13 hours after the bridge assault. Howard had to hold both bridges against any German force that appeared in the interim. His company of 180 men faced potential attack from the 21st Panzer Division, which intelligence placed within a few miles, and various German units stationed in the area. The German response was confused and delayed, providing crucial time for Howard to organize defenses. German commanders, awakened with reports of paratroopers and glider landings, initially believed these were diversionary raids rather than the beginning of invasion. Orders to investigate and counterattack were issued slowly, filtered through command channels, and reached frontline units after significant delays. This command paralysis, replicated across Normandy, gave Allied forces critical hours to establish positions before German forces organized coordinated responses. But confusion wasn't safety. German infantry probed Howard's positions throughout the early morning hours, testing defenses and attempting to determine British strength. German armored cars approached the bridges, were driven off by anti-tank weapons, and withdrew to organize larger attacks. At 3:00 a.m., a German tank attempted to cross the Canal Bridge, forcing Howard's men to engage with PIAT anti-tank weapons at close range. The tank was disabled but not destroyed, blocking part of the bridge and creating an obstacle for any German relief attempt. The paratrooper relief arrived piecemeal throughout the early morning hours. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Pinecoffin, commanding the 7th Parachute Battalion, reached the bridges around 3:00 a.m. with approximately 200 men, roughly half his battalion. The rest were scattered across the drop zone or hadn't yet reached the objective. The reinforcement provided additional firepower and allowed Howard to extend his defensive perimeter, but the force remained vulnerable to determined German attack. Pinecoffin's presence also created command complications. He outranked Howard and officially took command of the position, but he relied heavily on Howard's knowledge of the defenses and the situation. This is where Howard's willingness to disobey orders became crucial. The original plan called for Howard's company to defend the bridges until relieved, then withdraw to allow fresh troops to take over defensive responsibilities. But as dawn approached and German activity increased, Howard recognized that withdrawing his men would weaken the defense at the moment when German attacks were likely to intensify. His men knew the ground, had established fields of fire, and were positioned optimally to defend the bridges. Replacing them with paratroopers unfamiliar with the defenses would create gaps that German attackers might exploit. Howard approached Pinecoffin and argued that D Company should remain in position despite orders to withdraw. Pinecoffin, under pressure from increasing German activity and aware that his own forces were incomplete and disorganized, agreed. Howard's men stayed, violating the operational plan but maintaining defensive coherence at a critical moment. Throughout the day, German probes and limited attacks tested the defenses, but the combination of Howard's prepared positions and paratrooper reinforcement held against forces that should have overwhelmed the small British garrison. The morning brought air attacks by the RAF and bombardment from German artillery that knew the bridge's locations precisely. Howard's men endured shelling that killed and wounded several, destroyed one of the gliders, and created fires that threatened ammunition supplies. But the bridges themselves remained intact, and the defensive positions held. German commanders, still uncertain whether the bridge seizures were part of a larger invasion or isolated raids, committed forces cautiously rather than launching overwhelming attacks that might have succeeded through sheer weight of numbers. At 1:30 p.m., approximately 13 hours after the bridge assault, lead elements of the British Second Army advancing from Sword Beach reached Pegasus Bridge. Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade, preceded by his piper playing Scottish tunes, crossed the bridges and relieved Howard's exhausted defenders. The symbolic importance of this moment was enormous. British forces from the beaches had linked with airborne forces inland, establishing continuous control from the coast to positions beyond the Orne River. The eastern flank was secured, and German forces attempting to counterattack the invasion would have to fight through organized defenses rather than overwhelming isolated beach positions. Howard's decision to disobey orders and keep his men in defensive positions throughout the day was vindicated by results. The bridges were held, the eastern flank was secured, and D-Day succeeded in establishing a lodgment that couldn't be eliminated. But the decision violated military protocol and could have resulted in court-martial if outcomes had been different. Military discipline depends on obedience to orders, with commanders at higher levels making strategic decisions while frontline officers execute them. Howard's assumption that he knew better than operational planners challenged this hierarchy and set a precedent that could undermine military effectiveness if adopted widely. The complexity is that Howard was right. His intimate knowledge of the tactical situation gave him better judgment than distant commanders operating on assumptions that combat had invalidated. The plan's expectation that D Company could withdraw after relief was based on assumptions about German reaction time and counterattack capabilities that proved incorrect. Howard recognized this and adapted, achieving mission success through intelligent disobedience, rather than rigid adherence to orders that circumstances had made counterproductive. The British Army's response to Howard's action was to reward rather than punish him. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the bridge assault and his leadership during the subsequent defense. His men were recognized with various decorations, and the operation was celebrated as one of D-Day's great successes. The military establishment implicitly endorsed intelligent disobedience when circumstances warranted it, though official doctrine couldn't explicitly condone defying orders without undermining the entire command structure. The casualties from the Pegasus Bridge operation reflected both the violence of the assault and the relatively light cost of success. 2 men were killed in the initial assault, including Lieutenant Brotheridge. Several were wounded during landing and the bridge attacks. Throughout the day of defense, additional casualties accumulated from German fire and shelling. Total casualties for D Company were approximately 14 killed and 30 wounded from the company of 180 men. a roughly 25% casualty rate that was significant but far lower than casualties suffered at other D-Day objectives. The German casualties were harder to calculate precisely. Approximately 50 defenders at the Canal Bridge were killed, wounded, or captured during the initial assault. Additional Germans were killed or wounded during the day's fighting. German units attempting to recapture the bridges suffered casualties from defensive fire. The exchange rate favored the British significantly, reflecting both the advantage of surprise in the initial assault and the advantage of prepared defensive positions during subsequent fighting. The strategic importance of capturing the bridges intact justified the operation's risks and casualties. If the bridges had been destroyed, British armor would have been delayed by hours or days while engineers constructed replacements. This delay would have prevented British forces from advancing east of the Orne, leaving the invasion's eastern flank vulnerable to German counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division, attacking from the east, might have reached the beaches and disrupted the landings catastrophically. Holding the bridges ensured that British forces could advance inland, establish defensive positions, and protect the lodgement area. Post-war analysis identified the Pegasus Bridge operation as one of the war's most successful special operations when measured by objectives achieved relative to forces committed. Howard's company of 180 men captured and held 2 critical bridges against German forces that included elements of an armored division. The operation succeeded through careful planning, intensive training, extraordinary courage, and tactical flexibility when circumstances required deviating from plans. Modern military training uses Pegasus Bridge as a case study in coup de main operations and the importance of commander initiative at tactical level. Major John Howard returned to civilian life after the war, worked as a civil servant, and rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service. He attended reunions with D Company survivors and participated occasionally in commemorative events at Pegasus Bridge, but generally avoided the spotlight. He died in 1999 at age 86, having lived long enough to see the bridges he captured become monuments and his actions recognized as crucial to D-Day's success. The bridge across the Caen Canal was officially renamed Pegasus Bridge after the war, honoring the Pegasus emblem of British airborne forces. The original bridge was replaced in 1994 with a modern structure capable of handling increased traffic, but the original bridge was preserved and now sits next to a museum dedicated to the operation. Visitors can walk across the historic structure and view the museum's exhibits explaining the assault, the men who conducted it, and its importance to D-Day's success. The museum includes one of the original Horsa gliders, reconstructed from fragments recovered from the landing zone, standing beside the glider and looking at the bridge just yards away. Visitors can appreciate both the precision of the landing and the courage required to exit a crashed glider and immediately assault a defended bridge in darkness. The physical proximity of glider to bridge makes the operation's audacity visceral in ways that written descriptions cannot capture. The broader lesson from Pegasus Bridge is about balancing obedience to orders with tactical judgment. Military effectiveness requires discipline and coordination, which depend on soldiers following orders even when those orders seem questionable. But military effectiveness also requires thinking commanders who recognize when circumstances have invalidated planning assumptions, and who possess the moral courage to deviate from orders when mission success demands it. The tension between these requirements is permanent and unresolvable through doctrine. It depends instead on developing officers who understand when to obey and when to think independently. Howard's willingness to disobey orders by keeping his men in position rather than withdrawing as planned exemplifies this judgment. He recognized that the operational plan's assumptions about force availability and German response had proven incorrect, that withdrawing would weaken defenses at a critical moment, and that holding the bridges mattered more than following the specific procedures outlined in orders. He accepted responsibility for this decision, knowing it might result in punishment if outcomes were poor, but believing that mission accomplishment justified the risk. Modern military doctrine, particularly in special operations forces, incorporates principles learned from operations like Pegasus Bridge. Mission-type orders emphasize commanders' intent rather than specific procedures, giving tactical commanders authority to deviate from plans when circumstances require adaptation. This approach attempts to formalize the kind of tactical flexibility that Howard exercised informally, though no doctrine can completely resolve the tension between obedience and independent judgment. The story of Major John Howard and Pegasus Bridge demonstrates that sometimes the most important command decisions involve knowing when not to follow orders. The successful invasion of Normandy depended on thousands of individual actions, from strategic planning to tactical execution, but critical moments often came down to individual officers making judgment calls under pressure. Howard's decision to hold position rather than withdraw was one such moment, seemingly minor in the vast scope of D-Day, but potentially decisive for the invasion's eastern flank. The bridges he captured and held enabled British forces to establish the lodgment that ultimately led to France's liberation and Germany's defeat. And he achieved this not just by following orders perfectly, but by understanding when circumstances required intelligent deviation from those orders to accomplish the mission that mattered more than procedural compliance. The commander who saved D-Day by disobeying orders did so not through rebellion or disregard for military authority, but through tactical judgment that recognized when rigid adherence to plans would undermine mission success. Howard's story illustrates that military effectiveness requires both discipline to follow orders and wisdom to know when following orders literally would violate the spirit of mission accomplishment. This balance is difficult, depends on individual judgment rather than systematic procedures, and requires commanders willing to accept responsibility for decisions that might be questioned by superiors. Howard accepted that responsibility, made the right call, and contributed materially to the success of the largest amphibious operation in history. The bridges he captured still stand, renamed in honor of the airborne forces that seized them in darkness on the first minutes of D-Day, opening the path that led to victory in Europe.